Okay, so this is the second part of the Bible study on 1 Corinthians 6:12 through 7:9. This is in our Love and Marriage series. And we decided to take this together sort of as one text and one extended Bible study, but there's a lot of meat in here that I didn't feel like we could finish in 1 week. So it's 2 weeks, but rather than separate it into two Bible studies like we usually do, I wanted to kind of cover the whole text the whole time and keep it within its context. So today, if you haven't actually learned the first part of this Bible study, I'm going to suggest, and I don't really have authority to insist what you do. If you're watching this video on Facebook, you can do whatever you want, but that if you have not yet learned the first part of this Bible study, we're going to start on number 10. So I highly suggest you go back and watch the first part first and then continue on in this. And that way you'll have a better understanding of how we moved into this. So remember that you can download PDF copies of the Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And under the Love and Marriage series, you're going to find this as weeks 2 and 3, a two-part Bible study on 1 Corinthians 6:12 through 7:9. Now, because we're doing this together, I'm going to go ahead and reread the entirety of the text to make sure that we remember, at least as much as we can, what we talked about last week. So it says, I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. You say, food for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy them both. The body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You were not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man to not have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. To then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift and another that. Now to the unmarried and the widows, I say it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. All right. So we're starting in question 10 at the top of the second page. We last week talked about this idea that people were sort of justifying, it seems, their sexual immorality by pointing out that, the stomach's made for food and food for the stomach, by pointing out that they have the right to do anything, sort of this freedom in Christ argument. And he says, yeah, but even if you have that right, not everything is beneficial, and some things will master you if you give yourself to them, and it's not good for you to do so. And he points out that the food for the stomach, stomach for food, and in the end they're all going to be destroyed, so what's it matter kind of argument is flawed, in that it assumes that we were created to fulfill our inner desires. But he points out that we were actually created to serve and to glorify God. We were created for him, and that's where our logic is flawed, when we think that the fact that we have a certain desire gives us license to fulfill it whenever and however we want. And so I will say this, that was kind of the gist of last week's Bible study, and that's an important topic of conversation. And it's important for us to understand that Paul directly dealt with this flawed logic, because people are still using this flawed logic to justify certain things today that they have inner desires to do. And so we need to realize that this is not a brand new thing. This is not something that nobody's ever thought of, that we're just smarter these days than they were back then. And so now we've thought it through better, and we've got this clever answer and this clever saying. And it's good to recognize that that's not so clever, it's not so new, it was what was being said way back then, and Paul corrected the flaw in their logical thinking by changing what was at its base, which is changing the entire purpose, or changing their thinking, or correcting their thinking on what the entire purpose of our creation was. And when we realize that we were made for the glory of God, and he exists for us, then that changes everything else, because it shows the flaw that we began with in those other arguments. So we get to number 10, where it says, what do 6, 16, and 17 say about the sexual relationship? Now, I'm going to assume that you took my advice when we started this video, and if you had not watched the previous video, you went back and did that, so I shouldn't have to give you another disclaimer like I did last week, and explain to you why we're talking about sex in the church, but we are, and we're going to, because the whole world is talking about it, and the only one that doesn't seem to have a voice in the conversation these days is God, and it's largely because his people are being silent on the subject, or unfortunately in many cases are trying to twist or change what God has to say about the subject. So we need to speak, and we need to speak in love. We need to speak the truth in love and respect, and we need to also listen and care for people who have been hurt deeply. And I think all that really should go without saying, and it's the reason that the first week of this series we talked about love before we ever dove into the sexual relationship and sexual immorality, because it's really important for us to understand what love is and what it isn't. First of all, so we won't be thrown off by the argument that love is love, and if you love, because love is love, but most of what we think of love as love today is actually lust, and lust is not love. And so let's be really clear that if our desire is for self-pleasure, then we are on the wrong path. And if we are going to choose to disobey God's call and God's commands because of a sexual relationship with somebody that he has said is off limits, then we are, our God is our stomach, as we talked about before. Our God is our flesh, that we've chosen to please above God. Oh no, I love the person. Well, you can love a person without having sexual relations with them. Let me just say this. Why is sex such an important component of this? And I would argue that in most cases, it's because we're not talking about love at all. We're talking about lust. Okay, number 10 says, we already said, what does 6, 16, and 17 say about the sexual relationship? A, it unites us. B, we become one flesh. And C, it seems to say there's something special that happens in a moment that is beyond the physical. I would say that all of these are the case. It says, do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. And we can pull that straight out of Genesis. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, and the two become one flesh. And we talk about that in the marriage ritual. But it doesn't say, as we might say if we were talking about purely spiritual or emotional things, the two become one heart, or the two become one mind, or the two become one in spirit. In fact, it says we're one with God in spirit, or one with the Lord. But rather, it says when we unite with a prostitute, we've become one flesh. And likewise, when a man leaves his father and mother to be united with a woman, and it does say that, they become one flesh. And the reason is because there's something, we usually quote those scriptures without thinking about sexual things, I think, in the church. And that's why those are still okay to say out loud in marriage ceremonies and things like that, is because we've explained it away in some other way. We become one body, we become one. But the truth is that when we unite with someone, and this unite is talking about, at least in part, but I would argue in most part, or in primary way, is talking about uniting with them sexually. You become one flesh. And so there is something special that happens in the sexual relationship where the two become one flesh. And in a marriage, that's really significant. Now, why is that? Well, one, we are not people who are vulnerable with very many people. I think that may be even more true in today's society. We keep our guard up. We put up walls even in our personality and in our emotions and things like that. And we don't let everybody into every thought of our mind and everything. But there is something particularly vulnerable about being unclothed. And I don't want to get too graphic here. I don't know what age range might be watching this, but let me just say that there is something, you cannot have sexual relationships without letting your guard completely down. I don't believe it's very difficult to remain guarded when your most vulnerable parts are exposed, and it's very difficult to remain guarded. You may be able to put on a face, and I'm talking about literally put on sort of a face and pretend like somebody's not hurting you, or pretend like something isn't funny. I know that my kids, when they were little, would try to say they weren't ticklish. And I'm not ticklish. And so they would try not to laugh and put on a face, because if I found out they were ticklish, I might tickle them. My wife did the same thing for a long time when we were dating. Before she was my wife, she was not ticklish, she said. And so if you say that and people believe it, they'll stop trying to tickle you. And it's very nice. It's very you can put on a face. But there's one time, at least in particular, maybe you about get hit by a car and somebody scares you to death, and you let down your guard and you show your fear, or you shout or something. There are very few times that sort of force you to drop your guard and be completely transparent. But I can tell you that the sexual relationship, and particularly that one intimate moment, is a place and a time when your guard is completely down and you are not able to control what other people see about you. So you're vulnerable, and you're vulnerable in a way that you are not vulnerable at any other time in your life. And so the good news about that is that has the power and the ability to connect you with one person in a way that you will not ever connect with another person. And there is one person in my life that knows things about me that nobody else knows, and that's my spouse. So I think that we need to understand that there's something intensely personal, unguarded, and that happens in that moment. And because of that, it has the ability to join us in a particular way. We become one flesh. Now, the other thing, and we're going to kind of discuss this as we move down through the rest of these verses, the other thing that happens in the sexual relationship is that if, for instance, let me maybe perhaps use a euphemism that may seem less dirty to us, but if I have an itch that only one person on earth can scratch, then that creates a bond between me and that person, where I need that person. And that person, and if I'm the only one that can scratch that itch for that other person, then they also need me. I will say that a lot of people don't want to be needed. They don't want to be that vulnerable and need someone else. And because of that, many people have decided that it doesn't matter who scratches the itch. Anybody can scratch the itch. Anybody will do. And then we use people for our benefit, to scratch our itch, if you will, to please us. And we do that in various ways, with promiscuity. We do that in ways, if we've been hurt by a particular category of person, then we look to a different category to find somebody to scratch that itch, perhaps. But in the end, some of us just choose to scratch our own itch. And let me just say that we all think, oh, that doesn't hurt anything, and that's no big deal, and it does hurt something, and I'll tell you who it hurts. It hurts you. In fact, I believe we talked about this at the end of last week's Bible study. I think it was in number 8, or thereabouts. Number 9. And we talked about this because it says that this sin is one that you commit against your own body. So who does it hurt? It hurts you. And so you are the one that is missing the depth of connection and relationship that you could have had if you had allowed that sexual relationship to remain as God willed it between one man and one woman. Okay, if you'd allowed it to remain there where there was that one person that could ever scratch that itch, then you would have had a depth of connection that nobody, that you won't have with anybody else. And if you have been willing to find somebody else to connect with in that kind of deep way, then you are making that relationship more shallow and making it less valuable, and bringing other people into that kind of close personal intimacy that was intended for just you and one person. Okay, and if you are willing to take care of the job yourself, then you are ensuring that you won't connect on that sort of deep level with anybody, and nobody will be able to even scratch that itch quite as well as you do. I don't want to get, I'm trying not to get too terribly what some might be considered dirty here. I don't think it is supposed to be dirty, but I want to be clear about what we're talking about. And I just want to say that that pornography and lust, and what it I believe inevitably leads to, which is self-pleasure and masturbation, is something that damages you, and it damages your relationships, and it makes your relationships less deep, and the intimacy of the feedback loop that is required. If I depend on somebody else and I have to communicate with that person to know what they need and what I need to communicate that to them, is so significant, so important. And unfortunately, a lot of people have said, well, connecting with other people's hard, communication is hard. Let me skip the feedback loop. I know what feels good, and I'll just do this myself. And oftentimes using pornography or thoughts about a person, and ultimately, whether that person knows it or not or whatever, you are using that person for your own pleasure and benefit, which is literally the opposite of love. And what we talked about when we were talking about the first Bible study in this series with regard to love. And so self-pleasure is the opposite of love. Choosing to find somebody else to meet your needs and to please you instead of the person that God has called you and connected you with, is so selfish and the opposite of love. And by the way, it goes to like what I think most of us would consider worst case scenarios, that somebody might actually use a physical person for their own pleasure in the form of rape or molestation. And let me just say, you say, oh, I would never do that. I would never go that far. I don't think anybody that has gone down that path ever thought it would go that far. But as soon as you're justifying things, and believe me, it's like an addiction, it's like a drunkenness, where you stop thinking clearly and instead begin thinking about seeking after that high or that pleasure, and you do things you didn't think you would do. Okay, and any number of court cases, or even people that I've counseled with who have done unspeakable things, terrible things that we wouldn't want to talk about here. I can tell you that when I've talked to them, They were ashamed. They could not believe that they did something like that. And they don't know what's wrong with them that would cause them to do something like that. But here's what I firmly believe. I firmly believe that when we choose to go down a path of pleasing ourselves above everything else, that path doesn't stop where we thought it would stop. It keeps going beyond where we thought it would stop. Whereas a situation where a husband and wife are connected by this and both choose not to be the one who seeks after their own pleasure, but rather in love chooses to seek the other's best instead of their own, creates a situation where two people need each other, where two people are connected by a level of intimacy that is rare in human existence. And those two people are unique and do not think that I can get this anywhere. They value the place, and not just sexual, but I do think it's a part of the human relationship in spouses. But we value that person more because of the place they hold in our life to do something that nobody else can do. And I really think, I'm convinced of it, that this is critically important to our understanding of the marriage relationship and of sex. And I'm deeply concerned about how many people make light of this and do not think this way, but rather think primarily about their own pleasure. And let me just say that prior to coming to Christ and serving him faithfully, prior to being a Christian and a pastor, prior to being married to my wife, I was all of that. I focused on my own pleasure. In fact, when I met Cynthia, I made some very hard choices to say that this relationship will be different than anything I've ever had before, because I'm not going to treat it like that. And I'm not going to treat her like that. And we had hard discussions and we made hard decisions together. And my wife and I were engaged prior to our wedding for 16 months, and we dated for about 3 months before that. And never during that time did either one of us touch each other sexually. And in fact, because my brain had been so twisted before coming to Christ, I had to commit to myself, and this sounds crazy, that it would be okay if I never experienced that sort of sexual pleasure again. If it wasn't, if there was something in the marriage that even that did not fulfill it, that I was okay with that because I loved her for her, not because of what she could fulfill in me. And I set that expectation on purpose, because I needed to get my head right and reset my thinking on these things because it had been so wrong and so twisted. Let's continue on. Number 11, why might Paul say in 7:1 that it is good not to have sexual relations? So that, to many of us, sounds like the craziest thing we've ever heard. But A, I don't know, he must have been crazy. B, when you are united with a spouse, you now must care for that spouse. So that unity means that you have someone to care for beyond yourself, or that's a part of yourself now. And that will have the tendency to take our attention away if we're not careful from things that we ought to attend to and we would be attending to if we were devoted only to the Lord. So C says, without a spouse, you can focus more on the Lord. Now, I would say this, that I'm not single at the current time, nor do I plan to be, and I hope till I'm in the grave. But I know there are people, a part of our body, the body of Christ at Sandia, who are single for various reasons. And if they have been married before, they might be able to tell you better how certain things can be easier as you focus on God and are not distracted by so many things. However, we all also know that there are other things that can distract us other than a spouse or a family. Namely, our own sexual desires can take over our brain and take our focus away from God as well. And so one of the things that Paul addresses in this text is that if that's a thing that is distracting you, and for many of us it has been, is, would be, then we should be married. And that is how we should keep from that distraction and from that, and keep away from that way that we might be tempted to fall. So then 12 says, what does 7, 3, and 4 mean? So it says the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband in the same way. The husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. So A says sex is a duty that some married people just have to do, even if they don't want to. Well, let me say that in a literal sense, the way this is written, you might say that that could be true. But I would argue that it shouldn't be. This shouldn't be the way that we look at sexual relationships. And if this is where we are, then we actually need to back up and not fix our sex life, if you will, but rather fix our relationship in a deeper way, really separate and distinct from the sexual relationship. So in other words, there's something that has happened, perhaps injury, trauma, that has caused us to not value the connection that comes in our being able to please and fulfill our spouse. And so if that's the case, then we got something deep that needs to be addressed, because I don't think we're going to fix the sexual relationship until we've healed our emotional pain and trauma and healed the relationship back the way it should be. So in other words, the problem isn't our sex life. The problem is a deeper relationship problem, because it's not just about sex, because we, if our relationship were healthy, we would care about the needs of our spouse. And so there's a challenge there. So I don't think it should be you should do it even if you don't want to, but rather what we talked about before. B, there are certain things that only a spouse can and should do. We should not neglect those things. So if I know that I'm the only one that can and will fulfill this desire and need in my wife, then why would I not fulfill that for her? What isn't love to not withhold that from her, but rather to be sure that she is cared for and all of her needs are taken care of. And Not doing this does not justify us to say, well, he didn't do this for me or she didn't do this for me, so there's no justification there. But let me just say that I don't want my wife ever to be in a situation where she is tempted because this need is so deep or great that she's tempted to go somewhere else or to take care of it by herself. I want to make sure that she knows that I'm always here to take care of that for her. And I know you might say that that's easier for a husband to say than a wife, perhaps. I'm not sure it should be. Perhaps the reason that that's the case is because husbands have largely been the problem in the way we think of and talk about sex in our relationships. Maybe that's the case. But I believe this shouldn't matter whether you're husband or wife. You should feel the same love, because love is the basis for, and by the way, love being the basis is significant because we started out this whole series talking about love and talking about how most of us don't understand love, and most of what we see as love in this world is not love at all, but it's often lust, because love is selfless. And so if our relationship is based on love, love is not a feeling, love is a decision, and we have decided that that person's needs come above my own. And if we love one another like that, then this is not a question, then this is not an issue. So when I say that there may be a deeper problem and a place that needs healing, I'm concerned that the whole relationship may or may not have been founded on love to begin with. And so we're thinking about our own needs, desires, or what we don't want to have to do instead of thinking about the other person. C says, when a husband and wife become one flesh, we live to complete each other in every sense of that word, I believe. This is one of the best opportunities in all humanity to demonstrate true selfless love, and one of the most damaging, this is important too, damaging and hurtful experiences when we don't. Our utter vulnerability and reliance on each other in this area can create a bond that does not exist in other human relationships. I've said that, but the part we haven't talked about yet is the deep pain. The fact that this can become, sexual trauma can become one of the most damaging and hurtful experiences, because this is an area that was intended for a demonstration of selfless love, but somebody who has hurt us sexually has decided to choose themselves, which is hate themselves over the other person. It's hate instead of love, and they have injured us. And when somebody injures us in a place where we are most vulnerable, and somebody injures us in a way that should have created positive experiences, but instead it did not, it becomes even more painful. And we need to be aware of that in so many ways. One, if you or your spouse have experienced trauma, sexual trauma, sexual abuse, something of that sort, if you've been involved in a relationship where where sex was not I lost the word, was not an expression, there it is, was not an expression of love, but rather was an expression of love, lust, and selfishness and hate, then you likely are going to struggle at first to reframe this sexual relationship as God intended it. And if you're married, I'm convinced open discussion about this is important. It's possible that counseling is necessary. It's sensitivity is important, and caring for your spouse's needs emotionally through that is very important as well. And let me just say that choosing to be selfish in that moment, um, because the other person doesn't do what you expect, which is unfortunately too often how we end up interpreting these few verses that we've just been studying about the marital duty. Choosing selfishness by telling the other person that they need to fulfill that marital duty will likely cause even more trauma. And if the person has already experienced trauma, I think that you're doing more damage than you are helping the situation, and you may not even realize it. Um, so let's go to number 13. Why might some people have gotten the idea that sex is a duty in a bad sense, in the bad sense we're talking about, or is something other than a very personal and special thing that only a husband and wife can really experience as it should be? Because the church has talked about it like it's dirty or not talked about it at all. Perhaps that's a reason that we might have shied away from it, or thought that it was a duty in a negative sense that we had to do, and we don't like it, but we had to do it. B, because there are people out there who have made it a negative thing for others, and some of us still struggle with understanding how it should be because of these experiences. That's sort of a gentle way of talking about somebody who has been selfish sexually, and because of their selfishness, at the expense of somebody else, hurt somebody, and we then have framed it in a negative light because our only experience of it, or our first experience of it, was in a negative light. And so then it's hard for us to see it any different. I think that's often true, unfortunately. C, because the media has made it into something that it is not, and usually portrays it as a means of self-indulgence. That is absolutely true. And by the way, this is what we're all soaking in, and what our kids are seeing and hearing. And we need to speak into people's lives something different. Everything that's talked about sex, you will not hear what I'm saying spoken on primetime television ever. You will not hear somebody saying that this is a selfless act for the good of someone else. It's always an act of personal pleasure. That's how it's portrayed in media, on television. And that's how many people are living it out, and talking about it in their own lives. And we desperately need to change that conversation. Um, but we can't do that by remaining silent, and that's why we're talking about this today. Um, and then D says, because almost everybody we know, if they talked about it at all, talked about it as a means to self-gratification. And I think that's often true. Number 14 says, what is the only reason that Paul lists for a husband and wife to deprive each other? By mutual consent. And I've put this in parentheses, but I've underlined mutual. So in other words, it is a marital duty, and it should be in the positive sense. And Paul says that the only way that we ought to deprive each other is by mutual consent. Mutual means we both agreed to it. Well, I agreed, but he wouldn't agree. I agreed, but she wouldn't agree. Yeah, okay. Then that's not mutual consent. If you both agree together because you love the Lord so much that you're going to sort of fast from sexual activity to focus on God for a time, And it's clear that it says for a period of time and then come back together as agreed upon. But that time of prayer and sort of prayer and fasting, if you will, focusing on God, is the only reason, and that by mutual consent, that husbands and wives should not be fulfilling their marital duty according to this scripture. Okay. And so I do think that in our relationships, we need to walk through some healing. If there's some trauma that's happened that's causing us to not want to, be together with our spouse, then we need to work through that healing, because it's an unhealthy situation. And rather than let it persist, we need to heal so that we can get back into a healthy situation. Number 15, does this mean we should use the Bible as a weapon in our marital disagreements to prove to our spouse what they should or shouldn't do for us? So I know what's going to happen is somebody's going to say, see, hon, read it right here. They're going to, your spouse wasn't in church this week, so you're going to take your Bible to your spouse and say, see what it says here. It's your marital duty. Okay. This text is not intended to be a weapon. And if you use it that way, then you're the one causing the selfish trauma. You're looking at sex from a selfish perspective that is causing trauma in another person's life, and you need to quit it. Okay. And you need to start instead figuring out what it is that needs healed in order for this relationship to become more healthy again. And when the relationship is healthy, there should be a natural understanding and desire to fulfill the marital duty to one another. And it should not be a chore. And so there needs to be something healed or changed at the root and at the base of this relationship. And it's not going to be done by pointing at a scripture and telling them that they're ungodly. The second part says, does this mean that if I want to spend more time in prayer and my spouse does not, I can deprive him or her and then hold it over their head how unspiritual they are for wanting to keep me from praying? Yes or no? Explain. So this sounds funny. I'm not privy to most people in the church sexual conversations. So I won't say that I've heard this exact conversation, but I have heard spouses who are, in ministry or fasting or doing something that they feel God has called them to do, but their spouse is not on board with it. And they say, well, you're the one keeping me from God, and you're the one that's ungodly. And they start playing their spouse against God, whether their spouse was against God to begin with or not. And that is not healthy in a relationship. And the truth is that if you are the supposedly spiritual one of the two, and you are pitting them against God in all your conversations, then it's likely you who are driving them away from God, whether you realize it or not. And so you probably don't want to do that. But this could be another situation. See, I'm just trying to pray, and you can't keep your hands off me, and so that's why you don't love God. That's not what this is about. Okay. Number 16, is it possible for a spouse to make this a negative experience for their own spouse? Yes, no, absolutely. Unfortunately, I fear that this is often the case in marriages. And then the question is, how can we avoid this? How do we avoid this? It all goes back to love. If you truly love your spouse, then their needs and desires come first. And if that means that yours don't get fulfilled, then that should be okay with you. That would be okay with you if you really had chosen to love them. And maybe Things in your relationship might change if you chose to love, and for that love to also be expressed in the sexual realm of your relationship as well. Number 17, what can we do to make sure that sex is what God intended it to be and not what the world has made it for us and for the people around us? First, a good answer is love. So if we are practicing sexual practices that demonstrate selfishness instead of selflessness, then we are part of the problem. If we are talking about sex in a way that frames it as a selfish act instead of a selfless act and an act of love, then we are part of the problem. If we want to change the way people think about the sexual relationship, we have to first think about it different, practice it different, and talk about it differently in order for anybody else to see something different than what they've seen for the most part so far from our world, and unfortunately even from Christians. God help us. So hopefully this has been helpful. I know that it's probably been uncomfortable. If you were sitting right here in front of me, it would have been uncomfortable things to talk about. Might have been uncomfortable for you to think about or for you to hear me talk about it, but I'm convinced that it's necessary. And if we don't do it, then we are only allowing the situation to get worse. And honestly, I don't think the world and sinners are the problem with any of this, with anything that's going on in the world. I think the church is the problem, because if the church was being who we ought to be and speaking the message that God's called us to speak, then the world would not be in such a situation that it is. And it's become very clear to me that the church is not so different from the world in our acting and in our speaking. And we are part of the problem, but we could be part of the solution. So I want to invite you to be that part of the solution, first in your own thinking and actions, and choice to love instead of be selfish, and then in how you teach your kids and how you teach others what sex is supposed to be in a marriage relationship.